Hello and welcome to today's session on genocide denialism and how it applies to residential school denialism very specifically. My name is Sandra Bender. I'm the Community Engagement and Education Program Coordinator with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm tremendously pleased to have Dr. Sean Carleton with me today for this incredibly important topic. Dr. Carleton is a professor with the University of Manitoba in the faculties of Indigenous Studies and History, and is one of the leading scholars in Canada on residential school denialism. So it's really phenomenal to have this opportunity to speak with him today. Before we begin, however, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land and the water. The NCTR is located at the University of Manitoba in the city of Winnipeg, which exists on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Inninewak, Anishinaabe, Dene, and Dakota peoples. It is also within the territory covered in the legal agreement known as Treaty 1, the first of the historic treaties to have been signed. The Red River Valley here in Manitoba is also the birthplace and homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. The city of Winnipeg is sustained by the water of Shoal Lake, just over the Ontario border. We have been drinking Shoal Lake water since the time of World War I, when the aqueduct was built. The two nations who live along its shores only received access to drink their own water as recently as 5 years ago. Finally, the province of Manitoba is powered by hydroelectricity, which is sourced from waterways on Treaty 5 territories in the north and on the Winnipeg River system, which is located on Treaty 3 territory, as is Shoal Lake. So we acknowledge that by holding this talk today on these lands with potable water in our pipes and electricity to power this YouTube session, we are implicated in no fewer than 3 legally binding treaty relationships. As educators of settler ancestry, it is particularly important for both Dr. Carleton and I to acknowledge these legal and moral obligations to the First Peoples and to the land and the water that sustain all of us. So with that said, welcome, Sean. Thanks so much for joining me. Tell the people who you are.
Well, thanks so much for setting up this conversation, and I think it's a really important time to be thinking about how residential schools fits in the definition of genocide, and also how definitions of residential school denialism fit with other understandings of genocide denialism generally. So, thank you so much for creating this space as a non-Indigenous educator, but also someone that works with Indigenous communities, particularly on work to understand the full truth of residential schools. I see a lot from community about how hurtful and harmful residential school denialism is, right? Often my community partners will identify it as a kind of hatred, as a form of bullying or silencing survivors who have done a lot of work. And have shown a lot of courage to share their truths about their stories. And denialism, is sort of, viewed as a tool, as a weapon to silence them. And so I think that this is an important conversation to have. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what genocide is and how residential schools fit in it, and why we see denialism taking similar forms of genocide denialism. So I think this is a great time to have that conversation. And of course, you are yourself an expert on genocide. And I think I have lots to learn about, how to bridge this conversation and help people really understand the important truths of this. So maybe, I don't know, if you wanted to start off by offering some of your own expertise on what constitutes a genocide, just to kind of get us on the same page and help us understand where to start from.
Sure. I think expert is very generous. Person who knows a lot and has a deep-seated interest in genocide, sure. If we're starting with the historic definition, then we're going back to Raphael Lemkin's definition. If you're not deeply familiar out there, Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jewish lawyer who was in the midst of studying the Armenian genocide. It was looking for a legal term to kind of encapsulate that, a very intentional effort to annihilate a whole people. We had terms at the time like homicide, the killing of one person, suicide, the killing of the self, but not just the whole people. So, to quote him, when he defined this term, I'll just add too, being Jewish, he then went on to lose 49 members of his own immediate and extended family in the Holocaust, and he was really the driving force to push the newly formed UN to recognize a genocide as an actual thing, which they finally did in 1948 with the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment on the Crime of Genocide. It's a mouthful. So he described it this way. He said, new conceptions require new terms. By genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. This new word coined is to denote an old practice in its modern development. It's made from the ancient Greek word genos, meaning race or tribe, and the Latin side, thus corresponding, meaning killing, thus corresponding in its formation to such words as tyrannicide, homicide, infanticide, etc. Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended, rather, to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national and ethnic groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of individuals belonging to such groups. Genocide is directed against the national group as an entity, and the actions involved are directed against individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national group. So that was a mouthful. The understandings of what constitutes a genocide have evolved over time, but that basic one still stands. When the UN did accept Lemkin's definition, they actually expanded the three methods that he described, which include physical methods, meaning straight up killing. We tend to understand that. It's the other two that get less understood as acts of genocide. So Lemkin's other two, he described as biological methods, where the people themselves are prevented in some way from having children, so that as a people they go extinct. And then the third, the least understood, is the term cultural genocide, or cultural methods of annihilating a people, which is where you essentially make the people stop existing by making them forget who they ever were. So that's accomplished by denying language, cultural practices, spiritual practices, and it's really effectively done when you skim off the youngest generation and raise them with different language, religion, cultural practices, so that those kids then grow up not knowing who they are, regardless of what their physical features may resemble. So just to, zoom ahead a little bit. So when the UN accepted finally that this is an attempted crime, a deliberate, concerted effort to remove the people, they actually expanded it to include things like the forcible transfer of children to the control of another group. That alone, per the UN's definition, constitutes a genocide. They also included things like preventing measures, or instilling measures prevented to hinder the birth process. More recently, I quite like the historian John Cox's 2017 definition, where he talks about genocide as the concerted, coordinated effort to destroy any human group or collectivity as it is defined by the perpetrator. Genocide differs from other mass crimes against humanity and atrocities by its ambition. Genocide aims not only to eliminate individual members of the targeted group, but to destroy the group's ability to maintain its social and cultural cohesion, and thus its existence as a group. Because perpetrators very rarely provide explicit statements of genocidal intent, this intent can be uncovered by examining policies, actions, and outcomes, as well as the guiding ideology. So there are lots of other definitions out there, but understanding that an attempt at genocide is more than just the things that seem obvious to us, like gas chambers. 10-4, we understand that. But understanding these other elements that are targeted efforts to remove a whole group's existence from the face of the earth, that's where we get a bit lost. So, how then, within those super broad definitions, how do the residential schools qualify, if we will, as a genocide?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. It's one that I hear a lot of Canadians ask and perhaps feel uncomfortable with. I guess maybe a good place to start is that the House of Commons, right, last year unanimously agreed that the residential school system does qualify as genocide. We have had the Pope come to Canada and apologize and acknowledge the system as genocide. So I think one of the maybe easy places to start is that this isn't really up for debate. It's trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between perhaps a lack of understanding about what is genocide in the general population and help Canadians understand how it fits. I guess that's maybe a good place to start. And you had mentioned Raphael Lemkin, right? His definition and understandings of genocide was adopted by the United Nations, right? In the 1940s. And I think that it is important because often, as you were saying, people have a popular understanding of genocide as Jewish Holocaust, mass death equals genocide. And anything that's that doesn't fit that popular conception to them doesn't fit the definition. When in reality, the person who came up with the definition, right, had a much broader understanding of what constitutes genocide. And I think that that's important. It's also important to acknowledge that Lemkin's definition of genocide, a broader understanding, was continuously challenged by settler countries at the time, right? Countries like the United States and Canada challenged the notion that attempts at the destruction in whole or in part of a group, attacks on group life through cultural means, right? They challenged this notion, right? Because they understood very well at the time that the policies that they were implementing and maintaining for Indigenous people would qualify, right? And so there has always been this sort of reluctance on the part of settler colonial states, to weaken international law so that they can't be held accountable. Same thing with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which emerges, the first kind of conversations emerge in similar contexts. They've played out over decades, right? And originally, Canada, United States, Australia, etc., didn't vote in favor of this because they knew that the policies that they were enacting would, be in violation of this. So I think that in important contextual piece is there, that there has always been a concerted effort to narrow the definition of genocide so that settler colonial states' actions, are somehow outside of that, right? It's really, it's not just denialists that want to narrow the definition of genocide. It's actually settler colonial states that have played that role. But nevertheless, despite those efforts, if we read Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on Genocide, we see, again, as you were saying, that the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a group, attacks on group life include, A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, right? That kind of like that mental damage. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. and E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And when we understand the United Nations definition of genocide as not just being deliberately killing members of the group, we see that residential schools, fits many of these understandings of genocide currently, like in terms of how the United Nations understands this. It's just that the popular understanding of genocide is so narrow and is so connected to the Holocaust that people get their backs up, right? When you say, if the popular formulation is genocide equals Holocaust, when they hear residential schools being talked about in the same way, they're like, but these are very different. This is a false equivalent. Well, in fact, it's not making an equivalency. It's simply saying that there are differing understandings of how certain events and procedures and policies fit the definitions of genocide. That genocides have similar, have common characteristics, right? That attack on group life in whole or in part, but the ways in which different policies are enacted, there are of course differences. And so I think helping Canadians understand, as the TRC, if you pick up a copy, this is A Knock on the Door, the kind of abridged version, right? The beginning of that, in the introduction, the first page is walking Canadians through those differing understandings of genocide, physical, biological, cultural, and helping Canadians see how something like the residential school system fits within that definition of genocide. Right, that we can understand the practice of separating of children, from families and communities, sometimes by law. We see that forcible transfer. We see causing significant bodily or mental harm. I mean, as early as 1907, right, the Department of Indian Affairs' own medical officer was showing, the large-scale spread and transmission of disease and high numbers of deaths related to overcrowding, poor nutrition, lack of proper sanitation and ventilation, right? Which, all of this is very clearly fitting in the definition of genocide before that definition was made, right? Like, genocide is a long-standing practice, but the language to describe it emerges in the 40s, right? And so, in the early 20th century, coming out of Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce's report, part of the discourse around this was manslaughter, right? That Canada, he was calling it a national crime. And a lot of the debate emerging in that time was about manslaughter, right? And so I think these conversations about, the systemic mistreatment of children in these institutions, we like to think is a new concept. But right from early on in the system, even the Department of Indian Affairs' own officials were talking about, the mistreatment of children. And I think that it's helpful to understand it in relationship to these definitions of genocide. It might feel uncomfortable to see how it fits, but it does, both from the United Nations definition, but also now we are seeing politicians and senior church officials like the Pope acknowledging that. So, I think then that, again, this isn't up for debate. It's about how to help people understand. And that's where we're getting into this situation where, if residential schools are a genocide, that we also start to see people embracing that and understanding it, and then figuring out how we can learn from it and build better relations moving forward. But we're also seeing people engage in the same kinds of behavior to downplay, minimize, and misrepresent or distort basic facts about this genocide as in other contexts. And so I wonder if you might be able to explain a little bit more about what genocide denial or denialism is more broadly, and then maybe we can get into how residential school denialism is a variant of that.
Absolutely. My previous role was to work in the galleries at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where this came up a lot. They have an entire gallery called Breaking the Silence, which includes a digital study table covering around 20 mass atrocities or genocides, depending on how they're officially defined and by whom. We can talk about how terminology is super important, and denying terminology is a part of denialism. Every one of those sections or events covered in that study table is broken down into 4 sections. First, build up, how the event came about, what the circumstances leading to it were. Violation, which talks about how the genocide was perpetrated. And then the third section is called distortion and denialism, because it is a hallmark of every single atrocity or genocide that's committed. The fourth section is called Breaking the Silence, meaning how did the world come to understand this or know about it at all? Because hiding the evidence is a standard part of any genocide denialism, or any genocide. That the perpetrators destroy the evidence, destroy any records of it. We've seen that with every single historic genocide there has been, every modern genocide that there has been. I mean, the standard tactics look like, questioning the statistics, or, minimizing how many people were affected. That's always a part of it. The denial of deliberate intent or coordination. For instance, to this day, it's still considered an act of treason in the country of Turkey to call the Armenian genocide a genocide. They will say, yeah, a lot of people died. It was World War I. Lots of people died in lots of countries. We have evidence, very clear evidence by the architects of that event, that talk about things like language of the Armenian question, capital Q, the Armenian problem, what to do to get rid of the Armenians. It's all there. It's very well documented. Blaming deaths on other causes. So that example, there was a war on, lots of people died. Debating definitions or terminology, saying this wasn't a genocide. It was just an atrocity. It was just a massacre, like, some sort of lower form of tremendous crime against humanity. Victim blaming, or, I can give a very current example of disproportionate levels of response to an action. Say a teenager throws a stone at something, and the response is 20 machine guns then kill the child. For instance, those kind of disproportionate responses in the claim of self-defense. And then exaggerated claims of benevolence by the perpetrator. Those are kind of, that's a compilation of the standard tactics as defined by a couple of different scholars, Gregory Stanton and Adam Jones, primarily. But those are really common tactics. So, Sean, how have we seen that play out with regard to residential schools specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, another thing, just to kind of add on some layers here from the field of genocide studies, is that often, that denial or denialism is sort of understood as the final stage of a genocide, right? The covering it up, they also kind of downplaying, the kind of protecting guilty parties from prosecution. All of this is well documented in the field. You mentioned Stanton or people like John Cox, or here at the University of Manitoba, our colleague Andrew Wolford, who's a genocide studies scholar, who wrote a really great book called This Benevolent Experiment, which looks at how Indian boarding schools in the United States and residential schools here in Canada fit these definitions of genocide very clearly, but also mentions how, baked into the process of genocide is the tendency for those responsible to deny it, to cover it up, to minimize and downplay the harm on the group life as part of the process of maintaining that power over the group. And I think the other thing is that you mentioned Adam Jones, another scholar in the field, and he often talks about the psychological aspect of denial and denialism. In fact, one quick point is a lot of denialists will say, I'm not a denier. I don't deny that residential schools exist, which again is a misrepresentation of denial itself, because in the field, most Holocaust deniers, for example, they don't actually deny that the Holocaust happened. What they're doing is engaging in denialism as a strategy of downplaying, of quibbling with numbers. Like, is it 6 million or 4 million? If it's 4 million, then, there's all of these ways of sort of trying to minimize and challenge and question. So people will be more familiar with the concept of a genocide denier. But they're less familiar with the vocabulary of denialism. So let me bridge that gap and explain how we're seeing residential school denialism on the rise. So denialism generally, not just related to genocide, but as a strategy generally, is a deliberate attempt to twist, distort, downplay, minimize basic facts about something to shake public confidence in a consensus, right? And so we see this. We see denialism being used in the field of climate denialism, for example. People wake up and be like, well, I got a foot of snow on the ground, so global warming, clearly isn't a thing, when in reality that's not actually what climate scientists are. We actually might see crazy storm as part of a generally warming climate. So they're always, they'll use whataboutism, or they'll cherry pick a couple of examples here or there to really to throw a consensus that humans are, in fact, through their actions, contributing to the warming of the planet over time. Or we've seen a lot of science denialism around vaccines, the efficacy of vaccines, for example, in our recent world. So in our age of mis and disinformation, denialism is something that I think people experience a lot. They just don't have the language to identify it as such. And in the case of residential schools, I think a lot of people will understand much of what I'm going to say is as denialism, just not in those terms. Okay. So denialism in the context of residential schools is, again, that deliberate strategy to twist or distort or misrepresent basic facts about the system to shake public confidence in the process of truth and reconciliation. Okay. So denialists see reconciliation as a threat to their power and privilege and profit, and are engaging in denialism as a strategy to try to shake public confidence, to try and hive off support, to slow the momentum, right? To throw an anchor on to changes that they think are going to be detrimental. They want to preserve the colonial status quo and keep us stuck in that cul-de-sac because it benefits them, right? So what do? How do they do this? Well, they will use a series of rhetorical devices, right, to try to do this. So they'll say residential schools were actually well-intentioned, or they were of the times, that abuses are being exaggerated, that deaths didn't happen, or they were unavoidable, that really we should focus on the good intentions, or all the positive experiences that some students talk about. And all of this is being used as a way to sort of chip away and undermine the public consensus, right? That residential schools as a system was genocidal. It has ongoing effects for Indigenous people, and we need to find ways, to move towards reconciliation. Put it this way: the TRC had a very easy formula for everyone to understand, right? First, we must have the truth as established through an examination of church and state records, as well as survivor testimony. So we need to establish that truth, and Canadians need to understand it, learn from it, so that we can move on to the next steps, which is establishing healing, justice, and reconciliation. The denialists understand that formula very, very clearly. We think they're stupid, but they're very smart. And so they know that formula. And what they are doing is they're intervening in the truth stage, and they're trying to undermine people's confidence in the truth, to close off the avenues to healing, justice, and reconciliation. Okay. And so what we need to know is that all of these talking points that they use continuously have been rigorously debunked, so that we can move on with putting the truth before all of these other steps, so that we can create those paths to healing, justice, and reconciliation. So how do we see this manifesting in our world today? Well, unfortunately, we are seeing residential school denialism on the rise. It is too easy, I think, to think of this as just a bunch of, far-right extremists writing for illegitimate news propaganda sources like True North News, Western Standard, Frontier Center, as it has emerged, because a lot of those people that are creating denialist content, it's being consumed by a wider group of largely non-Indigenous Canadians, many of them on the right, but increasingly on the more mainstream part of the right, which risks these ideas becoming part of legitimate political discourse. We're seeing, politicians like Daniel Smith. We've just had elections in British Columbia and New Brunswick where candidates picked up residential school denialist talking points, talking about the so-called mass grave hoax, which is a right-wing conspiracy theory, comparing falsely residential schooling to the teaching of LGBTQ plus positive and inclusive education. It seems wild, but politicians are picking up this more extremist discourse and propaganda and using it as a way of hiving off support for reconciliation, making denialism part of a sort of right-wing backlash identity, giving Canadians who feel deeply uncomfortable with understanding the full truth, the complex truth of residential schooling, how it fits, for example, the definition of genocide, of figuring out how to challenge the myths of benevolence that Canadians have been taught as part of their identity, Canada the good, the peacekeeping, to understand that for Indigenous people, that is not the experience, past and present. All of those, denialism gives people like who are kind of concerned, right, or feel attacked by reconciliation, an easy out. And as a result, they consume denialism. And what's worse is that they spread it, right? They take those debunked pieces of mis and disinformation, they share them, they use them in their interpersonal conversations. It influences their political behavior, who they vote for, who they give money to, what they support. And that, I think, is the danger, right? We sometimes say, this is just mean things that people say on the internet. That's sort of a way that some people kind of minimize the harm of denialism. And I think that that's not right. We are seeing in this country that kind of hatred manifest in a number of actions. We are seeing, people showing up to the Kamloops residential school with shovels, demanding, proof of bodies, or this is just a big lie and a hoax. Even though we already know, thanks to church and state records, that 50 children, died at that school. They're asking for proof of things we already have proof of, right? We know that more than 4,000 children died in residential schools. We're seeing, attacks on commemorations with residential schools being torn down, being graffitied. And here in Winnipeg, as you likely know, there was a serial killer, Jeremy Skibicki, who targeted Indigenous women. And when the police, seized his social media accounts to figure out, how he got radicalized, what was he, how could someone do this? The only piece of anti-Indigenous racism that they found on his accounts were spreading residential school denialism at the time that he was targeting Indigenous women, right? So, the denialists, right, who do this for money, right? They publish books, they create articles to get clicks and to make money. They'll downplay this, but I think we do need to take the spread of denialism in our country very seriously. We need to understand it in these larger ways as a kind of genocide denialism that actually risks our opportunity in this moment to figure out how to build better relationships with Indigenous people and move forward. We cannot allow a handful of far-right extremists to block the path towards healing, justice, and reconciliation. And I think Canadians, have a really important role here in learning everything that we're talking about, but in particular, learning how to identify those denialist talking points to find more effective ways of confronting them at a societal level, but also into our interpersonal relationships. And I think, that's maybe the place, to spend the remaining our time is to think about, okay, so what do we do about this? How do we combat it? How do we help people in this work figure out how to put truth before reconciliation at a time when, denialism is on the rise and, people, particularly on the right, are determined to use this issue as a wedge to hive off support from reconciliation, to gain political power, which is I think not in the best interests of Canadians and Indigenous people as a whole. What do we do about it?
Well, it's interesting too. Just the concept of learning the truth, understanding the truth, but wanting to accept the truth as what it is. It's endlessly interesting, or bewildering, maybe is a better term to me, that we would rather believe a false narrative of what our country's actual history is than work toward building a country that we can be truly proud of.
Yeah, but Sandra, it shouldn't be bewildering to folks. I mean, this is why it's so important to have this conversation in the way that we have, because genocide studies scholars tell us that we shouldn't be surprised that people would rather deny the truth than accept difficult truths, change their behavior, and move forward in a different way. In fact, Adam Jones talks about this very notion that when confronted with the truth about genocide, people often respond, right, in ways like the cognitive dissonance, for example, that many Canadians will feel of, I'm a settler Canadian, right? I experience Canada as like a peaceful, tolerant, multicultural entity. I can't square that away with Canada was built through Indigenous genocide that is ongoing. And as a result, the way that they resolve that cognitive dissonance is they find denialism alluring, because it allows them to reconnect to move forward in a way that says, oh, maybe I'm just being misled by, like the small group of people who are trying to guilt me into caring about something. And by justifying it that way, they can say, True North and Western Standard and, all of these illegitimate propaganda outlets that are making money off of this, they're telling me the truth. It allows them to move away from accepting that difficult truth and figuring out how to build better relationships. So in some ways, it seems bewildering, like why people would go down that route. But actually nestling this conversation in the field of genocide helps us, because that is a predictable part of it. That is the last step of genocide. And when we know that, it actually makes having this conversation a lot easier, right? It means that, okay, denialism is not some kind of weird and wacky thing that we don't know is going to happen. In fact, we know it's going to happen.
Yeah.
We know the kinds of tricks and tools and rhetoric that's going to be used. So let's figure out a way to combat it effectively, right? It's not something like, when we understand it as a pattern, as something that we should, be expecting, I think there's an empowering nature to that, which means that we can have this conversation as like, okay, well, in other contexts of genocide, how have they dealt with denialism? What will work here? What won't work here? What do we need to adapt? What do we need to change? In some ways, I feel like that makes somehow moving forward easier when we understand it in that way, which is why it's helpful to approach this conversation in the way that we have.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is that easy out. Like you said, it's easier to let ourselves off the collective hook than to actually look at the truth and how to move forward in meaningful ways. So I've read so much of your work. You have multiple times now identified some of the really common arguments that we hear. Can you walk us through them, and so that we can understand better how to recognize them and how to debunk them and counter them when we're hearing them, around the Thanksgiving table or in workplace conversations or among friends?
Sure. I mean, it seems like that's what I'm spending a lot of my time these days doing. Before I get into that, I'll just say quickly that to help people with some of that work, my colleague at UBC, Daniel Heath Justice, and I collaborated on a free, accessible, easy to read primer on the most common denialist talking points and how to kind of refute them. And that's available on the conversation.ca. I think it's called Truth Before Reconciliation, 8 Ways to Identify and Confront Denialism. So for those viewers out there wanting to see that, you can kind of search for it in case I forget anything as I go through this. Some of the most common denialist talking points, if we just start with genocide, right? That many denialists will say, this isn't a genocide. You are being misled. This doesn't fit the definitions. Or what they will say is that it's really a cultural genocide, as if that is somehow a lesser kind of genocide. So all of the things that we talked about off the top of this conversation, again, kind of refute this talking point. We understand now that it is genocide, that church and state who are responsible for this system, right, have acknowledged that it was a genocide and has genocidal implications and ongoing legacies, that it fits the UN's definition, and that cultural genocide was just one of the ways in which Lemkin understood the process of genocide. It wasn't a ranking of like physical, biological, cultural. It was just a different way of understanding it. So I think by refuting some of those talking points, again, we can then open back up the conversation to, okay, then how does this fit? Other ways that denialists will try to then rebuff that. They'll say, well, the system really was well-intentioned, okay? Because one of the key issues is trying to figure out intent of genocide. It's a long-standing debate. Because people will say, it was well-intentioned, it was trying to uplift indigenous communities and provide them education, which they asked for, et cetera, okay? So if we go back, this is why, as a historian, this is important to me, is that if we go back to the mid-19th century and we look at what's going on in Canada, what becomes Canada, is that British North American colonists were figuring out ways to create a new country, eventually called Canada in 1967, the dominion of the British Empire, and figuring out how to gain access to additional lands and resources controlled by Indigenous nations. Like how do you expand out this new settler capitalist country? And they understood that Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous nations, particularly in the West, were barriers to that. And they were trying to figure out policies that would allow them to justify the expansion process, right? To move out from kind of central and eastern Canada to, create a new country from sea to sea. And they created a suite of policies, not just residential schooling, but signing treaties, creating the reserve process, establishing the Indian Act, which would subordinate Indigenous people as wards of the state. And residential schooling was a part of one plank of this larger policy shift, where we see Canadian policy related to Indigenous people become much more aggressive, right? And it's very clear from the beginning that church and state officials saw a national system of boarding schools funded by the government, run by missionaries, as a way of undercutting, in whole or in part, the group life of Indigenous people, right? Even John A. Macdonald, right, who was superintendent general of Indian Affairs, he chose that portfolio for himself when he gets reelected in the late 1870s, so he could oversee and quarterback Canada's colonial policies of Western expansion. He's in the House of Commons essentially justifying this new system as a way of intervening and undermining Indigenous lifeways to facilitate the expansion of Canada as a settler capitalist society. The intent is quite clear. They see, Indigenous children as collateral damage in the process, right? The callousness and indifference is very clear right from the beginning. If you read those reports of the Department of Indian Affairs from the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, we see that, the intent of this system is to intervene, right? People think about assimilation as a positive, right? They were understanding assimilation as like the attack on group life of Indigenous people, which we understand as genocidal. So the intent is quite clear. So when people say they're well-intentioned, it just shows me that they don't actually understand the history of the creation of that system. Okay, other things. Well, it was well-intended. It was of the times. They will say, well, everybody was a little racist back then, like big deal. Like we're judging the past based on the values of today. No, don't come at me with that. Because we know, as a historian, this is the work that historians can do. We know that at the time, Indigenous parents and students were very unhappy with the original schools that were being created, right? People will say, but they, in the treaty process, they asked for these schools. No, actually, they asked for resources to educate their own children on reserve. And the Canadian government didn't want to do that because it would support, their own sovereignty and autonomy, which they wanted to undermine. So they created a boarding school system, an industrial system, to facilitate their own needs. Okay. And parents were very unhappy with that. Students were very unhappy with that system right from the beginning. They talked about being overworked, young children being overworked in these schools because they'll say, but they were educational. Well, the system was run on a half-day system where, for the first part of the day, they were doing the education part, which was mostly religious conversion, right? Religious instruction. It was, they were not learning a lot in these schools, right? Most didn't advance beyond, grade 2 or 3. And then the second half of the day was doing chores, was essentially doing the work of the schools, keeping them going, doing the laundry, working in the fields, because they were underfunded. Churches exploited the children's labor as a way of keeping that system going. So, and the other thing is that it wasn't just Indigenous parents and students who were challenging, what was ultimately delivered. But as I said earlier, by the late 1890s and early 20th century, we're seeing missionary employees. We are seeing the Department of Indian Affairs' medical officer, Dr. Peter Bryce, talking about the consequences of this system. So we can use, the values of that time to challenge it. It's not just, they were not just of the time, right? There were critics of this system in its time. It's just that church and state benefited disproportionately from running the system. Churches got money, and the government got the another plank of its undermining of and attacking of group life that they didn't have to manage. They just had to put up some of the money for. Okay, other things quickly. That abuses are being exaggerated. I think they're actually being underreported. I think there's been lots of survivors that have talked about not wanting to talk about this abuse, for feelings of shame. A number of survivors have talked about this, or former students have said, I thought this was just happening to me. Now that I'm hearing other people, I want to come forward, but some don't. And I think that the story of abuse has sort of been overshadowed in recent years by news of student death in schools. And people will say, that deaths didn't happen, which they did, or that, they're being, they were unavoidable. So people will say, well, lots of people died of tuberculosis in the early 20th century. Residential schools aren't so special. That's just being, manipulated to make people feel bad, which again shows me that there is an educational gap, that people have not read the TRC report, which shows that yes, a number of in the general population, tuberculosis, was rampant and many people died. But in residential schools, with conditions of overcrowding, lack of proper sanitation, ventilation, poor nutrition, being overworked, all of these facilitate the spread of tuberculosis at rates higher than in the general population. And as a result, there are more deaths, than per capita than in the general population. But denialists at every stage will try to find one piece of evidence, right? That's the kind of cherry picking strategy to say, but what about the positives that students will say? And we really need to balance the positive and the negative. And again, this is a kind of false, a way of false balance, whereby any individual that had a positive experience or a positive recollection individually, that needs to be used to justify the positive intentions of the system as a whole. When in reality, many survivors, thinking about Ted Fontaine, for example, or Bev Sellers, who have written popular memoirs that people can pick up, they actually talk about so-called positive recollections, not as a positive of the system. Like things like playing hockey, for example. These were often coping mechanisms that students engaged in that offered maybe perhaps momentary bits of relief, but they're not actually, as former students themselves will explain, as like the system was okay, that being separated from their families and communities was positive, right? That's a way that in the science field, right, that people will say, you just take one piece of evidence and you like balance it, when in reality, 99.9% of climate scientists agree that humans are contributing to the warming of the planet. That one scientist out there, we don't need to balance it out and have a panel of 1 versus 1. It gives a false impression that that there is no consensus, when in this context there is. And it's not to discount survivors as positive recollections. It's to say that individualized experiences of joy, of positiveness, does not discount the consensus that the system itself was genocidal, and that so all of, I know I'm just giving you a spattering of those talking points, but we see them being used again and again, even though they have been rigorously debunked, because they are effective at convincing people, hey, did you know that tuberculosis killed a lot of people and you shouldn't care about residential schools? It's effective because people hear that and be like, oh, I didn't know that because I didn't read the TRC report. And now I can go off, into the wilderness and get lost down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory that makes me feel a lot better and justifies my lack of support for reconciliation efforts.
Well, there's a principle that's broadly applicable when looking at any social justice issue of not relying on individual or your own lived anecdotes, but rather looking at broader systemic patterns. So looking at the case of one man someone knows who went to a residential school and played hockey and loved hockey, and saying that therefore we know for a fact that not only was that individual's experience entirely good, when we know that especially, say, away games were prime grounds for sexual assault, but also that one experience is equivalent to the experiences of 150,000 other people.
Mm-hmm. And that things like hockey, to your point, were also, they would tour, outside of Indigenous communities, and that would be used as part of church propaganda to say, look at all the good things that we are doing. You should donate to us and get money. So that sometimes even what people see is like, I see smiling faces in pictures of people playing hockey. That was actually part of the process of justifying this system as being benevolent. And so, I think it's just people who know more about the system will be better prepared to guard against some of the ways in which these denialist talking points are misrepresenting, of twisting things always to try and justify rather than embrace and understand the complex and sometimes difficult truths.
Mm-hmm. It's harder to understand the nuance. These aren't necessarily easy issues to talk about, right? And if there is an easier out, we see people taking that. Like you said, we've both seen denialism being heavily on the rise. But that's why it's so important to recognize these arguments when we hear them, so that we can say, actually, false equivalency is never a good way to approach any social justice or human rights issue. Or good intentions is, as an argument, not a good way to make an argument. Intentions count, but end results count more. And also, we have all the evidence that the intentions of this as a system, again, not looking at individual people who may have worked within the system with all the best of intentions, howsoever misguided, but as a system, the point was an easier and cheaper colonization process, not the benefit of Indigenous folk.
Yep. And I think, this, I know we're running out of time, but this kind of goes to, my most practical way of combating this, which is that I think denialism flourishes in an environment where there is a lack of education or a gap of education. That, you can be spun or even allured by denialist talking points when you don't know a lot, right? That you maybe haven't read the section in the TRC report about tuberculosis and disease and death. So that when you hear someone say, yeah, but did you know that everything was, this was common? You don't have the confidence to push back on that and say, yeah, but I read this. And it talks about that. It acknowledges that actually. But I know that overcrowding and all of these other issues contributed to a larger amount of death. If we continue to put our emphasis on truth before reconciliation, we learn how to identify these common talking points, discredit them, right? So that when we see people engaging in these, we see them as like the new flat earthers, people that deny gravity, we can get on then with the harder work of facilitating healing, justice, and building better relationships for reconciliation. But as long as we are taking the bait of denialism, right, that we are not confident in the truth, we're going to fall prey to their attempts to keep us stuck there. And in many ways, that's the good news, is that people like Murray Sinclair, who is the chair of the TRC, always says that education is what got us into this mess, and education is what's needed to get us out. And I think part of that education is not just understanding the truth as told to us by the TRC and survivors, but also understanding, how some will choose to engage in the tools of genocide denialism to keep us stuck. And if we can learn how to identify those, then we'll have a better chance of combating them and getting back to that truth, healing, justice, and reconciliation formula.
Well, that's the goal, right? That it's why we're still here. That's why the NCTR exists, to continue the work of the TRC. It's why you exist in your function as a professor of history, of telling the truth, and of Indigenous studies. I'm just going to share below some resources for anyone who might be feeling re-traumatized by the subject. Please do reach out if you need support. And I'd like to take this moment to say an immense thank you to you, Sean, for your time, for sharing your wisdom. We could have easily gone for another hour. Understanding the truth and understanding, I think this is where looking to other patterns within other genocides out there can help us recognize and face the truth of our own nation's history so that we can move forward in good ways. So thank you so much for coming. And thank you to anyone who has watched with us live, or if you're watching in the future on YouTube, thanks to you for clicking on this as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I mean, I think I'm hoping that viewers will feel, encouraged that, this is not something that is unique to Canada. That in some ways, talking about genocide feels scary for a lot of people, but it actually is. It makes this easier because we know that other people have had similar kinds of conversations about how to deal with this and move forward in ways that can, create a better future for everyone. So again, thanks to the NCTR and to you, Sandra, for facilitating, I think, an important conversation, and look forward to continuing to do the work. And if anyone out there ever wants to be in touch, to find resources, the NCTR is fantastic. I'm always available. You can send me an email. This conversation, needs to continue, and know that there are supports out there and resources if you'd like to continue to learn how to be part of the solution to this.
Absolutely. I've just put your email there on the screen. You can also find mine the same way, sandra.bender@umanitoba.ca. Thank you so much to everyone. We've got some thank yous in the chat as well. And one question that I'm going to answer directly because it's a colleague of mine. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Bye.